I think the president's best defense is going to be all of these documents were declassified. I made it clear. We'll talk to Cash about this. And so the idea that I was mishandling classified documents is impossible because I had declassified all of this. He has basically the absolute power and privilege, as you've talked about, to declassify documents. Now, did he follow? The argument I would imagine from the Department of Justice will be he didn't follow proper protocols in order to officially declassify these documents. What were they? What did those protocols look like? But also, I think he has a defense of, look, you came down here in early parts of this year, and I said, hey, go through it. If you need to take some of these documents back, you can. I think he has a good defense that he can offer there as well, that he tried to comply with authorities and wasn't trying to keep these. And then I think he finally can say, I didn't even know about some of this stuff, right? Like, I'm not going through my boxes of memorabilia.
Governor Ron DeSantis is pointing something out here about the, you can trust the FBI line you're hearing in the background.
These agencies have now been weaponized to be used against people that the government doesn't like. And you look at the raid at Mar-a-Lago, and I'm trying to remember, maybe someone here can remind me about when they did a search warrant at Hillary's house in Chappaqua, when she had a rogue server and she was laundering classified information. I don't remember them doing that. I do remember them manufacturing a false conspiracy theory about Russia collusion. I remember that. That was not true. That was an abuse of power. I remember a lawyer for the FBI got caught doctoring an application for FISA surveillance against an innocent man. I remember the FBI, at Merrick Garland's direction, being sicked on parents going to school board meetings.
Clay, I remember it, and you remember it, and I think everybody listening does as well, and it's important context for everything that's going on right now. The people that are demanding trust have broken our trust on these issues and related to Trump. But to circle back to what you had just set up a second ago, the documents. Why would President? I mean, I'm honestly, this is beyond. I was a worker bee, right? Like, I was working in these documents in a vault in a secure facility all day long at the CIA. But presidents have a different, have different powers, obviously different authorities, and also they'll keep documents, I believe, to go into a presidential library. So perhaps that's part of this. But I have had people tell me that they believe that some of these documents were declassified specifically having to do with Russiagate, and that is why Trump wanted custody of them so that he could have his team at some point go through them. We'll ask Kash Patel about this later. What do you think? Why the boxes of docs?
I think the idea that Trump was going through in the final hours of his time in the White House and saying yes, no, yes, no. The analogy that I've made that I think registers with a lot of people is, if you've ever moved, how often are you unable to even hardly keep track of what you are moving from one residence to another residence? How long does it take you to get everything unpacked? This is why, Buck, to your point, I do think some things, however, he intentionally kept. Like we discussed, the Kim Jong-un letters. I think he may well have wanted to keep those. There may be investigative materials that are confidential that he believes buttresses his argument that he did nothing wrong with Ukraine, or that the Russia collusion hoax was all made up. And remember, they, long before this became a controversy, and we'll talk to Cash about this in the next hour, they made a big show, Buck, of saying the president has declassified a massive tranche of documents, and I don't believe those have been released to the American public yet. So he may wanted to have keep some copies of these documents to ensure that they were not destroyed by members of the FBI or the intelligence community that he had come to distrust. But this all kind of rolls into why this is such a difficult case, in my opinion, to bring criminal charges on, but also why Trump's responses can be somewhat contradictory. Number one, Buck, I think the president's best defense is going to be all of these documents were declassified. I made it clear. We'll talk to Cash about this. And so the idea that I was mishandling classified documents is impossible because I had declassified all of this. He has basically the absolute power and privilege, as you've talked about, to declassify documents. Now, did he follow? The argument I would imagine from the Department of Justice will be he didn't follow proper protocols in order to officially declassify these documents. What were they? What did those protocols look like? But also, I think he has a defense of, look, you came down here in early parts of this year, and I said, hey, go through it. If you need to take some of these documents back, you can. I think he has a good defense that he can offer there as well, that he tried to comply with authorities and wasn't trying to keep these. And then I think you finally can say, I didn't even know about some of this stuff, right? Like, I'm not going through my boxes of memorabilia. Buck, I've got all of my baseball cards. My sons sometimes are going through them. I can barely remember what I had from the early 80s. They're sometimes finding stuff like, Dad, did you know you had this card? Yeah, it got boxed up 25 years ago. I think he has a lot of defenses which would ordinarily lead to not a conviction being able to be granted. And remember, Buck, what they said about Hillary was no reasonable prosecutor would bring these charges because they don't believe they can get a conviction. That's the one thing hanging out here about this that I think is significant. Can they get a conviction?
Well, they would. The problem that we face, and I discussed this with a number of legal experts over the weekend. This is what I do on vacation. Ask legal experts over a gin and tonic. Excuse me, sir. But that is true, actually. That is what happened. A number of them were saying that if you bring this in D.C., the chance of you getting an anti-Trump jury, you're going to get an. You could indict Trump for assassinating Abraham Lincoln, and you'd get a guilty verdict in Washington, D.C. right now. It doesn't matter, right? They would go anything that you brought against Donald Trump would be a sufficient charge to get a conviction. I also think it's interesting that there's this story we're told that there's so much urgency. I saw this. Remember, I was texting with you before the Friday show about, now it's nuclear secrets, right? Because they have to, get everyone as scared as possible. Trump left 18 months ago, give or take. There's been back and forth negotiation over this. If it really is the kind of information that they want people to believe, the notion that they should wait and this would go back and forth between lawyers seems a bit of a stretch, right? If this really was, hey, here's where all of our super secret submarines are with their nuclear capability, whatever. I don't know what the information is, but think of the most sensitive stuff imaginable. And if it's not that, which I don't believe it is, Clay, this stuff is being held under under lock and key at Mar-a-Lago, where there's a Secret Service. You and I have been there numerous times.
Yep.
Secret Service detail patrolling the ground, security patrolling the ground, surveillance cameras on the storage areas where this is. So, how much more secure does the information have to be before they would say, well, maybe it isn't some grave threat to national security after all? And that's why we're at some level, we're going back and forth in the dark here, because without knowing what the info is, they keep saying you got to take our word for it. And I refuse to take their word for it. That's the problem. It would be silly to take their word for it.
Buck, I just want to put this case out in everybody's mind, because, again, we try to be ahead of where a lot of the media that you're going to listen to is. And so I think you're right about the forum shopping and the aspect that if an indictment is brought against Donald Trump, that a D.C. court would be very likely to convict him. But that wouldn't be the end of the story. There would be an appeal. And given the fact that any charges that are brought against Trump would theoretically be brought against and involving statutes that have not been used ever to prosecute a president before, there's an interesting case that came out, I believe it was in 2014. Virginia Governor Bob McDonnell was sentenced, found guilty of bribery in Richmond, Virginia. And they were accused of accepting gifts, vacations, loans from a Virginia businessman in exchange for helping the company. The Supreme Court, Buck.
Can I just add one thing to this? Because I got very fired up about this at the time. There was never even an allegation that they took an official act in the further, essentially there was no pro in the
Yes.
quid pro quo. They accepted gifts, and then the appearance of being around the governor was considered enough for the state of Virginia. Didn't want to bring charges. The feds came after him. He was talked about as a vice presidential contender for the Romney ticket, just to give everybody a sense of how high up he was at the time. Go ahead.
So 9-0, Supreme Court shot it down, and the ruling said that the federal government's view was far too broad of bribery law and how far it could stretch. And so the reason why I bring this up is these are not directly analogous cases, but given the Supreme Court's skepticism, I think it's fair to say of federal power in its current makeup, it is not extraordinary for me to think about this case against Trump, Buck, going all the way to the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court being charged with determining what exactly are the extent of President Trump's powers. Did he declassify these documents? Was there in any way a crime that was committed? I think it might well go to the Supreme Court if they bring charges.
And I also just want to remind everybody, this is one of my favorites, Clay. When you're wondering, is the DOJ, are prosecutors weaponized against Republicans? Think of all the high-level bogus prosecutions, including the Bob McDonnell prosecution that was overturned 9-0. I was getting heat from conservatives at the time saying, hey, guys, look, does it look a little gross? Yeah. Should his wife be accepting a Rolex from a businessman interstate just because? I don't know. It doesn't look so good. But if he didn't do anything that was actually in exchange for the gift, and he listed the gift, which he did, what are we, Clay, they wanted to send him to prison for 11 years, federal prison, for I think it was $175,000 in total in gifts. They wanted to send his wife to prison for 2 years, and they used that to force the plea. She wasn't even a public official. They said that she was part of the conspiracy to defraud the state of Virginia. Bob McDonnell, bogus prosecution. Chris Christie, bogus prosecution. Scott Walker, Rick Perry, Donald Trump. Go down the line, man. This is what they do. They get some lib hack prosecutor at the state level or the federal level to come after our people. They hid exculpatory evidence so they could go after Ted Stevens. And that Senate seat, by the way, then flipped Democrat. They lied to go after Ted Stevens. And without that, they wouldn't have gotten Obamacare through.
Well, one of the big ways, Buck, that you make a name for yourself is by attaching criminal charges as the prosecutor in cases like these. And most of the time, the prosecutors who are bringing these cases are intensely political in their own right. That's what's going on with Trump. If you can take a pound of flesh away from Trump, you elevate yourself in your state political hierarchy, whether you're in Georgia, whether you're in New York, whatever state you're involved in. I would just point out that whatever happens with the Trump low-level potential of charges, this thing is probably going to go all the way to the Supreme Court. So, and there's a decent chance that Trump could be validated now. Now, think, Buck, what's the immediate response going to be if the Supreme Court
of course
says
they're going to want a court pack and they're going to freak out? Imagine we get to a point where it's a 6-3 decision, which I think it would be, saying that these charges against Trump are bogus. I mean, the libs, what comes beyond, it is a bit like Spinal Tap. The dial will go to 11. Like, what comes beyond the lib meltdown we'd already see if Trump didn't face criminal charges or didn't face actual prosecution?
Just flag this audio, because what they would say is the only way Trump could escape criminal charges is by selecting his own jury.